My name is Kristen, and moving to the isolated house in the countryside was everything I needed to regain the peace of mind I had been longing for. The dirt road leading to the property wound through vast fields and dense forest, creating the feeling that I was leaving the real world behind. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the absolute silence that reigned around me. There were no sounds of cars, people, or any signs of urban life, just the occasional birdsong and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I felt a deep calm wash over me, as if nature itself was welcoming me into its tranquil embrace. Little did I know that in just a few nights, this tranquility would be shattered in a way that would change my life forever. Exploring the house felt like rediscovering a lost part of myself. Each room seemed designed for comfort, with large windows that let in the sunlight, revealing a simple yet cozy decor. The wooden floor creaked lightly under my feet, a sound I found oddly comforting. I opened the windows to let the fresh air circulate, bringing with it the earthy scent of the forest. Slowly I unpacked, organizing my belongings and transforming the space into a real home. The solitude that once frightened me now felt like an old friend. During the day, the house seemed like the perfect refuge. Sunlight filtered through the tree canopies, creating dancing shadows on the ground as I busied myself with settling in. Occasionally, I would pause to gaze out the kitchen window, admiring the lush landscape stretching as far as the eye could see. It was hard to believe that such a serene place existed. It was exactly what I had been seeking, a retreat where I could escape the stresses of daily life and find the peace I so desperately needed. As the afternoon wore on, I began to feel the fatigue of the move, but also a growing satisfaction as everything found its place. It was as if, with each item I arranged, a piece of myself also fell into place in this new environment. Feeling so at ease, I decided to make some tea and sit on the porch to watch the sunset. The transition from day to night was smooth, almost imperceptible, and the twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, creating a breathtaking scene. The sense of relief was palpable, as if the weight I had been carrying for so long was finally lifting. As night approached, I went back inside, pleased with the progress I had made. The soft glow of the lamps filled the rooms with a warm light, enhancing the feeling of coziness. I decided to take a hot, relaxing bath to prepare for my first night in my new home. Little did I know that, despite the apparent tranquility, something unsettling was about to manifest. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, unaware that the peace I had so longed for was about to be disturbed in a way I could never have imagined. The house was silent, except for the gentle creaking of the wood as it settled. Lying in bed, feeling the weight of fatigue pulling me toward sleep, something kept me awake. It was a sound, low and distant, but unlike anything I had ever heard before. My body tensed, and for a moment, I held my breath, trying to understand what it was. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the window, a light scratching noise that sent my mind racing for logical explanations. Perhaps it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. I tried to convince myself there was nothing unusual, but the sound persisted, piercing the silence of the night and making my heart race. I sat up in bed, my eyes fixed on the darkness that enveloped the room, each shadow seeming more menacing than before. Despite the growing discomfort, I tried to stay calm. The house's isolation, which had once seemed so inviting, now felt sinister. I knew there was no one around, no neighbors, no traffic, nothing that could explain that sound. Yet something kept me from getting up to investigate right away. Maybe it was the fear of discovering that something was indeed wrong. I remained seated, listening intently, hoping the sound would stop. The scratching at the window continued for a few more minutes, then finally faded away, leaving behind an even more oppressive silence. The relief was immediate but short-lived, as my mind began to question what could have caused that sound. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the unease lingered. I lay down again, but sleep, once so close, now seemed unreachable. As I struggled to fall asleep, a growing unease took hold of me. Whatever had made that sound, real or not, had planted a seed of doubt in my mind. I was alone in that house, and for the first time, that solitude did not feel like a blessing, but a curse. It was in this state of growing anxiety that I finally succumbed to exhaustion, unaware that this was only the beginning of what was to come. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of unease that had followed me from the night before. I tried to focus on the day's tasks, but the memory of that sound would not leave me. After having my coffee, I decided to investigate the window from where the sound seemed to have come, hoping to find a logical explanation. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine as I noticed something strange on the glass. There were dirty handprints smeared across the glass, as if someone or something had pressed against it during the night. My heart started to race, and I instinctively stepped back, feeling the fear beginning to take hold. I tried to rationalize, thinking it might just be accumulated dirt, but the prints were too specific. They were clearly handprints, and they were fresh, as if made recently. Terror began to set in as I realized that this could not have been caused by the wind or some animal. There were no footprints or any other sign that anyone had been outside, but the prints were undeniable. My mind raced to the worst possibilities, imagining that perhaps someone had been spying on the house during the night. The idea that I was not alone, that someone or something was out there, made me feel more vulnerable than ever before. Fighting against the panic, I decided to check the perimeter of the house. With each step I took, my anxiety increased, but I needed to know if there was any evidence of an intrusion. To my relief, I found nothing out of the ordinary, except for those disturbing prints on the glass. Even so, the sense of security I had felt upon arriving at the house was now in ruins. I felt that something was wrong, and the walls of the house, once so protective, now seemed to be closing in on me. Back inside the house, I decided to lock all the doors and windows, hoping to regain some sense of control. But as I turned the locks, I knew that my peace of mind had been irreparably compromised. The place I had hoped would be a refuge now seemed to hide something I could not see, but that was clearly there, watching me. That night, as I prepared for bed, the fear of the marks on the window was still fresh in my mind. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that the house was now completely locked up, but the unease persisted. When I finally lay down and turned off the lights, silence was once again my only companion, but this time, it did not bring comfort. Every sound, no matter how small, made my heart jump. Then I heard the footsteps. At first they were soft, almost imperceptible, but soon they began to grow clearer and more distinct. They came from outside the house, slowly circling it, as if someone was walking around, exploring. My body was paralyzed with fear, and I lay motionless in bed, listening to each step with feverish attention. Every beat seemed to echo inside me, increasing my terror with each passing second. The footsteps grew closer, getting louder as if whatever it was approaching me. I was torn between the urge to get up and check what was happening and the fear of discovering something much worse. The sound was unmistakable, and the thought that there might be someone or something out there terrified me. The isolation I had sought so eagerly now felt like a trap. I decided that I could not just lie there doing nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and with trembling hands got out of bed. Every step I took toward the window was accompanied by a wave of fear that threatened to knock me down. When I finally reached the window and looked outside, all I saw was darkness and silence. The footsteps had stopped as soon as I approached, leaving me with a feeling of emptiness and helplessness. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The night seemed to drag on endlessly, with every sound in the house amplifying my fear. Whatever had been out there knew I was inside, and the idea of being watched by something unknown left me in a constant state of alert. All I wanted was for the night to end, for the day to bring some explanation, but I knew my life in the house would never be the same again. By the third night, fear had become my constant companion. Every noise, every shadow kept me on edge, and sleep seemed increasingly distant. I tried to stick to my normal routine, but the anxiety was palpable. What had started as a mild suspicion had turned into a constant terror. When I finally lay down, trying to ignore the fears creeping into my mind, a new sound broke the silence. The footsteps returned, but this time, they came from all directions. Before I could react, the lights in the house began to flicker, and then went out completely, plunging everything into oppressive darkness. My heart raced, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by the sudden darkness. It was then that I realized someone had cut the power. The thought that someone outside was controlling what happened inside my house was enough to send me into total panic. Groping in the dark, I desperately searched for my phone, which I had left beside the bed. My trembling hands finally found it, but before I could turn it on, I heard a noise that chilled me to the bone. The back door was being forced open. The sound of the wood creaking alerted me to the imminent danger. My refuge was about to be invaded, and the terror of the situation froze me for a brief moment. What I feared most was about to happen. The sound of something scratching the walls and knocking over furniture came from outside, but soon everything fell silent. I knew I needed to act, but the fear was paralyzing me. My mind raced in all directions, searching for an escape, a way to get out of this nightmare. Whatever it was trying to enter the house with frightening precision. All I could think about was finding a place to hide before it was too late. Finally, I decided I couldn't just stay there doing nothing. If I stayed put, I knew I'd be an easy target. Trying to stay calm, I took a deep breath and started moving through the dark, each step bringing me closer to the hallway. I knew I needed to find a safe place, but with each movement, the panic inside me grew. Whatever was outside was about to get in, and I needed to race against time. As I fumbled in the dark, I heard a sound that made me freeze in place. The back door was being forced with more intensity, and the creaking of the wood echoed through the house. Terror gripped me, and I realized there was no more time to think. I needed to hide before the intruder could get in. I looked around, desperate, and saw a small closet in the hallway. It was my only option. I ran to it, trying not to make any noise, and hid inside, gently closing the door. Inside the closet, the space was cramped, and the air felt suffocating, but it was the only place where I felt relatively safe. I breathed shallowly, trying not to make any noise that could betray my presence. Outside, I heard the sound of the back door slowly opening, followed by careful footsteps entering the house. Every beat of those footsteps seemed louder, closer, and I had to fight not to scream. The intruder began moving through the house, opening drawers and knocking things over, as if searching for something, or someone. Every sound made my heart race, and the fear of being discovered was almost unbearable. I could hear the noise of furniture being dragged, doors being opened and closed. It was clear that whoever it was, they were determined to find me. The terror was so intense that my vision began to darken at the edges, but I forced myself to stay conscious. The footsteps grew closer and closer to my hiding place, and I knew that if I were discovered, I would have no chance of escape. My body was rigid, my muscles ached from staying in a tense position, but I couldn't move, couldn't do anything but wait and hope that the closet would be ignored. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and I felt that at any moment the closet door would be opened. Time seemed to stop when the footsteps stopped outside the closet. I held my breath, expecting the worst. I heard the sound of something being knocked over nearby, but the closet door remained closed. For a moment I thought maybe the intruder had left, but then I heard footsteps again, this time moving away slowly. The tension inside me eased a bit, but I knew the danger wasn't over yet. I needed to get out of there, but how? The silence that followed was so dense I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I believed the intruder was moving away, and I made the decision to try to escape before it was too late. With all the care in the world, I pushed the closet door open and peeked into the hallway. It was empty, but the fear still gripped my chest. I knew I didn't have much time, so I moved as quietly as possible toward the bedroom on the second floor, where a window might be my only escape route. But as soon as I set foot on the first step of the stairs, a treacherous creak echoed through the house, and I knew I had been heard. The sound of hurried footsteps behind me confirmed my worst fears. The intruder knew where I was. Without thinking, I ran up the stairs, feeling the panic take over as the footsteps grew closer and closer. My only hope was to reach the window and escape before they could catch me. The journey to the bedroom felt like it took forever. Every step was a struggle against the fear that threatened to paralyze me, but I kept running, driven by adrenaline. When I finally entered the bedroom, I closed the door behind me and rushed to the window. My trembling hands fumbled to unlock it, and for a moment, I thought I wouldn't make it. The footsteps were getting closer, and I knew I was running out of time. Finally, the window gave way and I opened it, feeling the cold night air against my face. I looked down and saw the drop that awaited me. It wasn't a fatal height, but I knew the fall would be painful. I had no other choice. The sound of the bedroom door being broken down behind me gave me the final push I needed. Without thinking twice, I climbed onto the windowsill and prepared to jump. As soon as my feet left the windowsill, I felt a mix of relief and terror. The world seemed to slow down as I fell, and the impact against the ground was harder than I had imagined. Pain exploded in my legs, but I knew I couldn't stop. I got up with difficulty, feeling my legs buckle, but the need to escape was stronger. The intruder was inside, and I needed to get as far away as possible. Landing outside was painful, but fear gave me the strength to keep going. Injured and struggling to walk, I forced my legs to carry me toward the road. Every step felt like a challenge, but the adrenaline pushed me forward. I heard a noise behind me, and my heart nearly stopped. They were coming. The only thing I could do was run, but with my injured legs, I knew I didn't have much time before I was caught. As I ran, my mind was in complete despair. Amid the chaos, I remembered my phone in my pocket. With trembling hands, I pulled it out, and in the midst of my desperate run, I called emergency services. My voice came out in a terrified whisper as I begged for help, barely able to explain my location before the call was cut off. I kept running until I decided to hide in a large bush among the trees lining the road. In the terrifying silence that followed, I crouched between the thick branches of the bush, trying to control my ragged breathing. I could hear the intruder's footsteps approaching, their low, tense voices as they searched for me. The dread of being discovered made my heart race even more. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a fragile hope, but I knew that until the police arrived, my safety depended on staying hidden. The police lights finally illuminated the road, and I watched them through the leaves of the bush, feeling a mix of relief and panic. I knew help was close, but I still didn't dare leave my hiding place. I remained motionless as the intruders hesitated, realizing they no longer had time before they were found. The sirens grew closer, and soon I saw the officers spreading out across the area. Only when I heard the officers calling my name did I emerge from the bush, still trembling with fear. The officers found me and helped me out while others headed toward the house. Still gasping for breath, I looked back at the place that was supposed to be my refuge, but had become a nightmare. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving room for shock and exhaustion. The night had been a whirlwind of terror and survival, and I knew that experience would mark me forever. The house, which I had so eagerly looked forward to calling home, was now just a terrifying memory. As I watched the police lights fade into the distance, I realized that, despite everything, I had managed to survive. But what happened that night, and who or what had been after me, would continue to haunt my thoughts, leaving a mystery that might never be solved. My name is Renata. I'm 29 years old, and after another long day at work, I was finally back in my luxury penthouse. The elevator, smooth and silent, took me straight to my private floor, and as soon as the door opened, I felt the immediate relief of being home. The building's security had always been impeccable, something I trusted completely. Leaving the city's hustle and bustle behind as I entered my private refuge was a pleasure I cherished. However, that night, something was about to happen that would forever change my perception of safety and turn my home into a place of terror. I entered the apartment, closing the door behind me with a sigh. The panoramic view of the city at night was as stunning as ever, the light shimmering like distant stars. I walked to the window to admire the scenery, something I always did to relax. I was used to this quiet routine, a kind of ritual to unwind after a day full of meetings and important decisions. The cozy environment and the silence were what I appreciated most. Yet, at that moment, I felt a small twinge of unease. There was something in the air that unsettled me, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just accumulated fatigue, and headed straight to my bedroom. The thought of a hot bath seemed perfect, but something made me stop suddenly. As I turned toward the terrace, I noticed something that made my heart beat faster. The terrace door was open. Immediately, a chill ran down my spine because I was absolutely certain I had locked it before leaving for work. The cold night air was blowing in through the open door, making the curtain sway gently. I stood there, motionless, trying to understand how this had happened. I knew it was impossible that I had forgotten to lock it, yet the door was open. I decided to walk out to the terrace to investigate, with a growing sense of discomfort inside me. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, and the silence that once comforted me now felt threatening. As I reached the door, my heart raced. The cold air enveloped me, and a sense that something was deeply wrong took hold of me. But at that moment, I still had no idea what I was about to discover. I walked slowly onto the terrace, trying to stay calm, but fear was beginning to take root in my chest. I looked around, examining every detail of the space, trying to find a rational explanation, but instead, I found something much more disturbing. My belongings were out of place, as if someone had been there, tampering with everything. My heart raced even faster as I realized this wasn't just a simple oversight on my part. At first, I tried to convince myself that it could have been me, perhaps in a rush or distraction, but every item out of place told me otherwise. The sofa cushions were strewn about haphazardly. A flower vase that usually sat in the center of the table was now near the edge, and my laptop, which I always left in the office, was on the living room table. There was no way all of this could have been the result of forgetfulness. Someone had been there, and recently. I began to feel fear taking over, replacing any attempt at rationalization. The idea that a stranger had invaded my space, my refuge, was unbearable. However, the worst part was knowing that if someone had indeed been there, they might still be inside the penthouse. My mind started racing, searching for alternatives and solutions. I needed to check the entire apartment, but the terror that the intruder might still be present paralyzed me. I decided to start searching the house, feeling an increasing sense of dread. The hallway leading to the bedroom seemed longer than usual, and every shadow became a potential threat. My footsteps echoed in the silence, and I felt as if I were being watched. A persistent thought hammered in my head. What if the intruder was still there, hiding somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike? I continued the inspection, my heart beating erratically as I cautiously opened each door. Nothing seemed out of place in the bedrooms, but the feeling that someone had been there was undeniable. When I finally finished checking all the rooms, I returned to the living room with a knot in my stomach. I needed help, but the fear that the intruder was still nearby kept me from acting rationally. What should I do now? I went back to the living room and approached the phone, intending to call the building's security. However, something made me stop, as if an invisible presence was there, watching my every move. I looked around trying to stay calm, but the sense of imminent danger was palpable. The silence in the room seemed heavier, as if the air was thick with tension. And then, suddenly, the worst happened. The intruder appeared before me. He emerged from the hallway with a swiftness that took my breath away. For a second, I was paralyzed, my body frozen with fear. All I could think was that this couldn't be real. I was standing in front of a complete stranger who had invaded my home, and he was now just a few steps away from me. His eyes locked onto mine, revealing intentions that were anything but good, and panic consumed me. My mind screamed for me to react, but my body refused to obey. The intruder took a step toward me, and it was as if time had slowed down. My breathing was rapid and erratic, and I felt despair take over. It was like being trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was enough to make me understand that I was in mortal danger. And then finally, my survival instinct took over. I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us, but he moved even faster. Fear gave me the strength to react. I spun on my heels and ran toward the other side of the living room, with him right behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and the panic I had felt earlier now turned into pure adrenaline. I needed to escape. I had to find a way to save myself. I ran toward the kitchen, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out of this situation. There was no time to plan or reason. All I could do was act on instinct. I knew he was right behind me, and that any mistake could be fatal. The sound of my feet hitting the floor echoed through the penthouse, mixed with the sound of his footsteps chasing me. There was no turning back. The kitchen seemed like my only chance to buy some time. I rushed in, feeling the panic grow with every second. The terrace door was just ahead, but the thought of going outside, where there was no escape, terrified me. Instead, I decided to move through the interior rooms, hoping to throw him off. The panic made my hands shake as I tried to close the kitchen door behind me. However, the intruder was quick and determined. He managed to force the door open, nearly causing me to lose my balance. With no other option, I ran to the living room, trying to put some distance between us. My eyes searched for something that could help me create a barrier between us, something that would give me an advantage, even if only temporary. The large sofa in the center of the room seemed like the only viable option. I used all my strength to push it, creating an improvised barrier. But he didn't give up. I saw his eyes fixed on me as he tried to maneuver around the sofa without wasting time. That cold, determined look made the fear inside me grow even more. I knew I didn't have much time before he found a way to reach me. I decided that I needed to keep moving. I couldn't stay still. The apartment, which had always been a place of comfort and safety, now felt like a prison. I kept running, moving from room to room, trying to find a way to escape this nightmare. Every door I closed behind me was a desperate attempt to buy time. My cries for help echoed off the walls, but deep down, I knew no one could hear me. The intruder was getting closer, and hopelessness began to set in. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. My last attempt was to hide in the bathroom, locking the door and trying to control my breathing. I could hear him outside, his footsteps getting closer. Time seemed to be running out. My heart was racing, and the panic was almost paralyzing. I knew that if he managed to get in, I would be defenseless. The fear of being caught was almost unbearable, but I knew I couldn't give up. I couldn't let him catch me. Cornered in the bathroom, I felt despair consume me. Every second that passed brought me closer to being caught, and I knew I had to act quickly. I looked around, searching for something I could use as a weapon. My hands trembled as I grabbed a bottle of perfume, knowing it was a minimal defense, but it was all I had. The sound of the intruder's footsteps approaching put me on high alert. The bathroom door shook as he began to force it open. My mind raced, trying to find a solution, but the panic made it hard to think clearly. I knew it wouldn't be long before he managed to get in, and I needed to be ready to fight for my life. I raised the perfume bottle, prepared to use it as a last line of defense. The fear was almost paralyzing, but the will to survive kept me standing. The door burst open, and he entered the bathroom, his eyes locked on mine. I didn't think twice. I sprayed the perfume into his eyes, trying to blind him temporarily. The intruder screamed in pain and frustration, bringing his hands to his face, and I seized the moment to push him with all my strength. He staggered back but didn't fall. I knew I had to keep fighting, even though my chances were slim. I ran back to the living room, my mind focused on finding something else to defend myself with. The panic gave me energy, but I knew I couldn't keep going like this for long. I grabbed a heavy lamp and held it with both hands, waiting for his next move. He recovered quickly and came at me with fury. My heart was beating so fast it felt like it was about to explode. I was ready to fight to the end. When he got close, I swung the lamp at his head with all the strength I could muster. The impact was strong enough to knock him down, but I knew he wouldn't stay down for long. I needed to act quickly. I ran toward the front door, desperately trying to unlock it with trembling hands. The sound of his movements behind me hurried me, but fear made me clumsy. I knew my time was running out. My desperate screams echoed through the penthouse as I fought to open the door. Every second felt like an eternity, and the fear of being caught gave me the strength I needed to keep trying. Finally, I managed to unlock the door, but I didn't have time to open it. I heard the intruder approaching again, and I knew I had to keep fighting. I screamed for help, hoping that someone, anyone, could hear me. The next few seconds were a blur of panic and struggle. I ran into the hallway, trying to escape the intruder's reach, but he was right behind me. The only thing that kept me moving was the hope that my screams had caught someone's attention. I knew the apartments next door were occupied, and I prayed that a neighbor had heard the commotion and called the building's security. As I ran, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening somewhere in the hallway. My hope was renewed, but the fear of being caught before help arrived was still overwhelming. I kept running, moving from side to side, trying to evade the intruder. My body was exhausted, but the adrenaline kept me on my feet. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going, but I couldn't stop. The hallway light flickered when I heard heavy footsteps approaching from the other side of the front door. I recognized the sound of security boots and felt an immediate wave of relief. I knew help was on the way, but I still needed to buy time. I ran back to the living room, my heart racing, and prepared for one last attempt at defense. The sound of voices in the hallway gave me the strength to keep fighting. Finally, I heard the sound of something heavy hitting the front door, followed by firm voices. The building's security was there, and I knew salvation was within reach. The intruder, realizing what was happening, tried to reach me one last time, but the front door was broken down with a crash, and the guards entered the penthouse. The intruder hesitated, knowing his escape was blocked, and it was at that moment that the situation turned in my favor. The guards entered the penthouse with full force, weapons drawn and ready to act. The intruder, seeing that he was cornered, retreated, but there was nowhere left to run. I moved away as far as I could, looking for a safe corner while the guards took control of the situation. My heart was still racing, but the relief of seeing security finally there made me feel a little safer. However, I knew the danger hadn't completely passed yet. The guards advanced cautiously, surrounding the intruder, who now seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. He looked around, searching for an escape, but the options were limited. In one last act of desperation, he tried to run toward the terrace, but was quickly subdued by the guards. There was a brief struggle, but he was outmatched and ended up being overpowered. I watched the scene with my heart in my throat, still unable to believe this was really happening. When they finally restrained him, I felt such an intense wave of relief that my legs nearly gave out. The adrenaline that had kept me standing until that moment began to fade, and with it came extreme exhaustion. One of the guards approached me, ensuring that I was safe and out of danger. His calm and firm tone helped to ease the panic I was still feeling. But the images of what had happened continued to spin in my mind. As the intruder was handcuffed and taken out of the penthouse, I allowed myself to breathe a little easier. Even so, the shock and fear remained, like a shadow I couldn't shake off. The guards began asking questions, trying to understand how he had gotten in. But at that moment, my mind was so confused that I couldn't formulate clear answers. All I knew was that the nightmare was finally ending. After the intruder was removed from the penthouse, one of the guards stayed with me, ensuring I was okay. He offered me a chair and I sat down, feeling the exhaustion take over. The sound of sirens approaching outside indicated that the police were on their way to handle the rest of the situation. Although I was still shaken, I began to feel a sense of safety slowly returning. But I knew the impact of this event would stay with me for a long time. When the police finally arrived, the intruder had already been restrained, and the situation was under control. I watched from the chair, still trembling slightly, as the officers took statements from the guards and began investigating the scene. I felt drained, as if the last drop of energy had been drained from me. All I wanted was for this to end quickly, so that I could try to return to normalcy, though I knew that would be difficult. One of the officers approached me, asking routine questions about what had happened. I answered as best I could, but my mind was still foggy, processing the events that had just occurred. As I spoke, I saw the intruder being led out, handcuffed and surrounded by guards. There was a coldness in his eyes, something that made me shudder. He showed no remorse, and that frightened me even more. The officer with me tried to reassure me, saying that the intruder could no longer harm me, but the words, though well-intentioned, couldn't completely dispel the fear. I knew he was right, that I was safe now, but the memory of being chased and attacked in my own home was hard to erase. The feeling of vulnerability was still overwhelming, and I knew it would take time to recover. After the police finished collecting information, one of the guards offered to escort me to a nearby hotel, where I could spend the night safely. I accepted the offer, knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep in that penthouse, at least not that night. As I left the building, I took one last look at the penthouse that had for so long been my safe haven. Now, it seemed strange and threatening, a place where I no longer felt at home. As I got into the security car, I felt the weight of the past events finally hit me fully. Exhaustion, fear, and relief mingled in a whirlwind of emotions that I could barely process. I knew that incident would stay with me for a long time, a constant reminder that the security I had taken for granted could be so easily shattered. But for now, I was alive and safe, and that was all that mattered. Coming home late at night after an exhausting day at work had become routine for me. The routine was relentless, and the silence that enveloped me when I crossed the threshold was a welcome relief. My house, my refuge, always seemed to greet me with an invisible embrace, easing the tension that had built up throughout the day. I quickly climbed the stairs, eager to take off my suit and relax. However, that night, a subtle discomfort began to creep in, a feeling that something was about to happen. I dropped my briefcase by the entrance and let out a tired sigh, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had followed me since I entered. The solitude of the night was something that usually calmed me, but for some reason, it felt heavier that night. I decided to ignore it, convincing myself it was just accumulated fatigue, and began getting ready for bed. I was about to leave the day's problems behind and sink into the comfort of my bed. As I changed, the silence of the house, which normally brought me peace, began to feel oppressive. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water before lying down, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the house, and for a moment I felt vulnerable, as if the comfort of my home had been replaced by something unknown. That strange feeling persisted, something I couldn't explain, but that made me hesitate. Fatigue was getting the best of me, and I knew I needed to rest. I lay down in bed, adjusted the pillow, and closed my eyes, hoping sleep would come quickly. I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong, that it was just another night like any other. But deep down, something told me I was about to experience the most disturbing night of my life, something that would forever change my perception of safety. With my eyes closed, I tried to ignore the unsettling thoughts swirling in my mind. I focused on the silence, letting it envelop me, but the feeling that something was wrong continued to grow. That's when I heard the sound that made me open my eyes suddenly, a sound that shouldn't have been there, breaking the silence of the house and signaling that the tranquility of the night was about to be shattered. The sound coming from the kitchen made me freeze in bed, my heart racing. I stayed still, trying to listen more closely, but the silence now felt even denser. The unease that had been just a vague feeling was now turning into palpable fear. Had I dropped something, or was I just imagining things? My mind tried to find a logical explanation, but fear began to dominate my thoughts. I needed to check, but I hesitated to get up. Finally, I decided I couldn't ignore it. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound, as if some instinct was telling me to be careful. I walked towards the kitchen, each step echoing on the wooden floor, increasing my anxiety. When I reached the kitchen entrance, the chill that ran down my spine was impossible to ignore. The window, which I was sure I had closed, was open, letting the cold night air in. The sight of the open window made my chest tighten. The unease was turning into panic, but I needed to stay calm. I looked around, trying to find any sign that someone had entered, but everything seemed to be in place. However, the open window was a clear sign that something was wrong. Maybe a strong wind had forced it open, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Despite seeing no one, the feeling that I wasn't alone deeply unsettled me. I knew I needed to investigate, but fear was making me hesitate. I walked through the kitchen, trying to see if anything else was out of place, but nothing seemed to have been touched. Even so, the sense that there was a strange presence in my house was undeniable, and I couldn't simply go back to bed and pretend nothing was happening. The only thing I could do was keep checking the house to make sure I was really alone. But with each step I took, the tension grew. I knew that if someone was indeed there, I couldn't ignore it. I looked at the staircase leading to the upper floor where my bedroom was and braced myself for what I might find. Fear was starting to take hold of me, but I knew I had no choice but to continue. With my heart still racing, I began to climb the stairs, each step feeling like a greater challenge than the last. The house was plunged into absolute silence, which only heightened my sense of alertness. Reaching the top of the stairs, I looked around, expecting any sign that something was out of place. But to my mixed relief and suspicion, everything seemed in perfect order. However, the discomfort persisted, as if something was lurking. I decided to start inspecting the hallway where the bedrooms were. Each door I opened revealed an empty and silent room, but the fear inside me continued to grow. I checked the guest room, the bathroom, the office. Everything was exactly as it should be. However, the apparent calm of the house didn't bring me any comfort. On the contrary, the absence of anything abnormal made me even more uneasy. As I walked down the hallway, I felt as if I were being watched, as if someone were lurking in the shadows. It was an irrational feeling, but impossible to ignore. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that the sound I heard in the kitchen and the open window had a logical explanation. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. After finishing my inspection of the upper floor, I went back down, my heart still pounding. I knew I needed to make one last check before trying to go back to sleep. I passed through the living room and the kitchen once more, looking for any sign that someone might have broken into my house. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling that I wasn't alone continued to torment me. The unease was turning into an almost paralyzing fear. I decided I needed to check the basement, the only part of the house I hadn't inspected yet. I knew that if someone was there, it was the most likely place to hide. With a flashlight in hand, I headed towards the basement door. Every step was a battle against the growing fear inside me. As I approached, I heard a loud, heavy noise coming from the basement, making my heart almost stop. The sound echoed through the house, shattering the silence in a terrifying way. The noise in the basement was so loud and unexpected that it made me instinctively step back. For a moment I was paralyzed, trying to understand what had happened. It was as if something heavy had been knocked over, and the sound echoed off the walls, making the fear inside me grow even more. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I had to find out what was going on. However, the terror of going down to the basement was almost unbearable, but I knew I had no choice. I tried to summon the courage as I approached the basement door. My hand trembled slightly as I held the flashlight, but I couldn't back down now. I opened the door slowly, trying not to make a sound, and looked into the darkness that stretched out before me. The basement had always been a place I avoided visiting at night, but now it seemed even more sinister, as if it were hiding something in the shadows. With each step I took towards the stairs, my heart beat faster. I descended the first few steps cautiously, the flashlight illuminating only a small part of the path ahead of me. Silence reigned once again, but the fear inside me continued to grow. I needed to know what had caused that noise, but the idea of finding something or someone down there terrified me. I paused for a moment in the middle of the stairs, trying to listen for any other sound that might indicate the presence of an intruder. The basement was shrouded in almost total darkness, and the flashlight seemed weak in comparison. Every step was a battle against the urge to run back upstairs and lock the door behind me, but something compelled me to keep going. Maybe it was the need to know, to understand what was happening in my own house. Even so, the feeling that I was approaching something dangerous was undeniable. When I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped, trying to steady my breathing. The flashlight trembled slightly in my hand, but I kept moving forward, illuminating every dark corner of the basement. That's when I noticed a shadow moving, a figure hiding among the stacks of boxes. My heart almost stopped when I realized I wasn't alone. The intruder was there, hiding in the shadows, waiting to attack. The sight of the figure hidden in the shadows made me freeze with fear. For a moment, all I could do was stare at the darkness where the intruder was hiding. The silence in the basement was almost deafening, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heart beating rapidly. There was no longer any doubt. I wasn't alone. Terror consumed me completely, but I knew I couldn't let it take over. I needed to react. I gripped the flashlight tighter, trying to keep my hand steady, as the flickering light revealed more details of the intruder. He was armed with a crowbar, which made my blood run cold. The thought of being attacked with that weapon terrified me, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't just run. I was cornered in the basement with no clear escape route. The only option was to defend myself as best I could. The intruder realized he had been discovered and advanced towards me with a quick and determined movement. My survival instinct finally took over, and I stepped back, trying to keep some distance between us. I knew I needed to find something to defend myself with, something that could give me a chance against him. I looked around, desperately searching for an improvised weapon as he got closer and closer. My eyes locked onto an old tool, a wrench that was on a nearby shelf. Without thinking twice, I grabbed it with one hand, still holding the flashlight with the other. The intruder was almost upon me, and I knew I had to act quickly. I raised the wrench, trying to appear more threatening than I felt, as the flashlight's beam flickered, casting terrifying shadows on the walls around us. He didn't hesitate and attacked with the crowbar. Reflexively, I managed to block the blow with the wrench, but the impact was strong, nearly knocking me off balance. Pain radiated through my arm, but I couldn't afford to falter. He attacked again, and I used all my strength to fight back, trying to keep the distance between us. The fight was fierce and desperate, and every move seemed to be a matter of life and death. The struggle in the basement became a fierce battle for survival. Every blow we exchanged was accompanied by a wave of fear and adrenaline. The intruder attacked with relentless force, and I could barely keep up with his quick movements. My only advantage was the wrench I held, but I knew that if I made a mistake, it could be fatal. The basement had turned into a claustrophobic battlefield, where every step could be my last. The wrench gave me some defensive power, but the weight of the intruder's crowbar made each impact devastating. I blocked another blow with difficulty, feeling my arms grow weaker by the second. Panic threatened to consume me, but I knew I couldn't let fear take over. I had to keep fighting. I had to survive. Every passing second felt like an eternity, and all I could think about was escaping this nightmare. For a brief moment, I managed to create some distance between us, giving me the opportunity to take a few steps back. The intruder seemed determined to take me down, and his attacks grew more aggressive. I tried to think of a strategy, but the terror and exhaustion made it difficult to think clearly. The only thing I knew was that I had to find a way to bring him down before he reached me again. He advanced once more, and this time, I managed to dodge just in time, using the wrench to deflect the crowbar. The feeling of always being one step behind was terrifying, but I couldn't give up. As he recovered from the failed attack, I seized the chance to strike with all the strength I had, aiming for his hand holding the weapon. The impact was strong, and he cried out in pain, dropping the crowbar to the floor with a loud crash. That moment of vulnerability was the opportunity I needed. With the intruder disarmed, I retreated even further, trying to create a safe distance between us. But he didn't seem willing to give up so easily. The hatred in his eyes was palpable, and I knew that even without the crowbar, he would continue to pursue me. The fight was far from over, and the feeling that my life was hanging by a thread drove me to keep fighting with all my strength. Even with the intruder disarmed, the threat he posed was clear. I knew I needed to get out of there before he fully recovered. I took advantage of the brief moment of advantage to back away, my eyes fixed on the staircase leading back to the upper floor. Every second counted, and I was determined to escape this nightmare. I ran toward the stairs, trying to reach freedom before he could catch up with me again. As I ran, I heard the intruder move behind me, determined not to let me escape. The distance between us was shrinking with every step, and I knew I had to be faster. Panic took hold of me, and every movement felt like a race against time. The feeling of being hunted was suffocating, and the basement, with its shadows and dark corners, seemed to close in around me. The staircase was just ahead, but the doubt that I would make it to safety was growing. Adrenaline gave me one last push as I reached the stairs. I climbed the steps as quickly as I could, feeling the intruder get closer and closer. I knew that if he caught up with me there, on those narrow stairs, I wouldn't be able to defend myself. Every step was a battle against fear, a struggle to keep moving. The sound of his footsteps right behind me made me speed up even more, even as my body began to falter. Finally, I reached the top of the stairs, almost tripping on the last step. I glanced back for a brief moment, seeing the intruder quickly closing in. There was no time to waste. I ran towards the door leading to the living room, trying to escape this nightmare for good. My heart was pounding so fast it felt like it would explode at any moment, but the thought of being so close to freedom gave me the strength to keep going. When I reached the door, I looked back one last time, seeing the intruder almost within reach. With one last desperate effort, I slammed the door shut, trying to block him on the other side. I knew I couldn't keep him out for long, but I needed every second I could get. The feeling of being so close to escape, yet so close to danger, was almost unbearable. There was no more time to hesitate. I needed to act now. With the door closed, I ran through the living room, trying to think quickly about what to do next. My heart was still racing, and adrenaline was coursing through my body, keeping me moving. I knew the intruder wouldn't take long to get through the door, so I needed a quick solution. The only thing that came to mind was calling the police, but the phone was on the other side of the room. Every second counted, and I couldn't waste any time. I reached the phone, my hands trembling as I tried to dial the emergency number. My fingers could barely press the buttons correctly, but I finally managed to make the call. As the phone rang, I looked at the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. When the operator finally answered, I began speaking quickly, my voice filled with fear and urgency. I explained the situation as quickly as I could while keeping a watchful eye on the door. The intruder was on the other side, and I knew I didn't have much time. The operator promised to send the police immediately, but the wait felt endless. Every passing second was torment, but I couldn't let my guard down. While I waited, my mind raced, trying to think of how to protect myself until help arrived. Finally, I heard the sound I had feared. The door began to give way under the pressure of the intruder, and I knew he was about to get in. With the phone still in my hand, I backed up to the other end of the room, looking for something to defend myself with in case he got through. My eyes landed on a heavy metal statue on the coffee table, and without hesitation I grabbed it firmly. I knew this might be my last line of defense. The door burst open with a crash, and the intruder entered the room, his eyes fixed on me, full of rage and determination. There was no more time to run, only to fight. My heart raced, and adrenaline took over once again. Holding the statue as if it were my only salvation, I prepared for the final confrontation. I knew the police were on their way, but every second counted, and I needed to survive until they arrived. He advanced quickly, and I reacted instinctively, swinging the statue at him with all the strength I had. The impact was direct, hitting his shoulder and making him stagger back. It wasn't enough to bring him down, but it gave me a precious moment to retreat further, creating a crucial distance between us. He screamed in pain, but his gaze only became fiercer, as if he was even more determined to get to me. The fight continued, each of my movements driven by pure survival instinct. My arms ached from holding the statue, but I knew I had to stay strong. The intruder tried to attack me again, but I managed to dodge, and in a quick motion I struck his shoulder, making him stagger back. He fell to the ground, dazed, and I took advantage of the moment to distance myself, creating a safe gap between us. Sensing that he was temporarily incapacitated, I ran to the front door, trying to keep him in sight while I waited for the police to arrive. My breathing was labored, and fear still dominated me, but the sound of sirens in the distance gave me hope that it was all about to end. I maintained a defensive stance, ready for any move, but I knew help was on the way. A few minutes later, the police arrived, bursting into the room with determination. They quickly subdued the intruder, ensuring he couldn't harm me. The relief I felt was indescribable, and I finally let the statue fall from my hands, the tension beginning to dissipate. I stood there, still trembling, as the police took control of the situation. As they handcuffed the intruder and let him out, I felt the adrenaline fade, leaving behind a crushing exhaustion. I had never been so close to losing my life, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I watched in silence as he was taken away, realizing that this night would forever change the way I saw my own home. Sitting on the couch, Trying to process the events of the night, I began to understand just how fragile the feeling of safety can be. My home, once a place of peace and tranquility, was now marked by the terror I had experienced. But above all, I knew I had survived, and that was what mattered most. The police were by my side, and I knew that in time, I would be able to regain my sense of security, even though the memories of that night would stay with me forever.